Now, is it going to let me use presenter mode? There we go. Thank you. I appreciate your patience. Okay, so my name is Brooke Boulton. I teach at Winona State University, which is in Winona, Minnesota, in the USA. And today I'm going to be talking about translingual approaches to academic writing and pedagogy in doctoral education. So some of what I'm going to be sharing with today comes from a research project that I did a few years ago, which studied how multilingual writers approach their dissertation writing in English. So it was an international comparative study, and some of the data that I'll be sharing with today comes from that study. So a couple of things just to ground us in the dissertation and academic writing. So globally, English is the language of knowledge production in academia. Academic English is no one's first language. I take that from Ken Highland. The dissertation, regardless of the language that we're working in, is a barrier to success in a doctoral program. And one of the theories that I developed out of my research was the theory of meaningful productive performance, which I found is something that students engage in, multilingual writers engage in when they are navigating and negotiating writing and identities across multiple languages. So it's within that space that translanguaging is happening. And there's a lot of research published about translanguaging, but less is published related to academic writing at the doctoral level, and as far as how we can provide pedagogical support for multilingual writers in doctoral programs who are already using some of these translanguaging practices. So if you're unfamiliar with the term translanguaging, I have a few different references at the end, but most of what I draw from with my definitions are Kanagaraja and Li Wei, who have published pretty extensively on translanguaging, Estella N.A. and Ula Connor as well. So to participate in translanguaging means to draw upon your full linguistic or literacy repertoire to make meaning in a target language. So in the context of what I'm talking about today, that target language would be English. The definition that I have written for translanguaging is navigating and negotiating meaning across multiple languages to create authentic expression in the target language. And this comes out of the research that I've done in which students communicate that what they are trying to achieve in English is an expression of themselves, their identities, their linguistic identities, their cultural identities, their scholarly identities, all of these different components when they are writing in English. And we know that when academic English is our target, different from our conversational English, that becomes even more challenging. So translanguaging can happen in the spaces of thinking. It can happen when we speak, when we read, when we write, and the next slide will break that down just a little bit more. Okay, so I like to refer to translanguaging practices. The participants in my study often referred to using what they called a native language filter, which is when they would, regardless of how many languages they were negotiating between, they would take the meaning in perhaps their native language or their L1 or an L2. I'm sorry, reverse that. They would take what they were trying to say in English, run it through a native language filter to see if they could accomplish close to the same meaning in English as they might express themselves in their native language or the language that they're most comfortable using. So some of this happens when we think. Students or participants often refer to thinking in one language, but not being able to think in English, and they would sort of measure their proficiency in English as not thinking in English. So translating can also be a big part of a translanguaging practice. So thinking and how we are translating in our thought processes, how we are translating in our writing processes, in our reading processes, and then of course, combining those together. So related to mobility, related to authorship, students would often ask, who do I want to be and who can I be in English based on the access that I might have to resources, or to the standards that are set up in academic English that I'm struggling to accomplish or meet. So I apologize if this is a little bit small, but I just wanted to let you see the visual of how this meaningful, productive performance happens. So a participant might begin in her native language, participate in an interlanguage process, which is where that negotiation and navigation is happening, and eventually getting to this native language filter. So the native language and the interlanguage is sort of an ongoing process, ultimately the goal being the target language. So in the case of the dissertation, academic English. Okay, so a thought is generated into a native language, sentence is produced in interlanguage, and then we see where that filter happens. And that's where meaning, authenticity, and expression are navigated and negotiated more intensely. Okay, so taking that idea and then applying it to this visual concept, the translanguaging space is indicated where those hash marks are. So embedded in that meaningful, productive performance. As a student is actively negotiating and navigating, they are participating in those translanguaging practices. Okay, so using all of the access they have in as many languages as they're able to use to communicate their ideas effectively and authentically. Okay, so I'd like to share just a little bit of evidence from the data that I collected. The reason I'm sharing this is because it indicates how important it is for students to be able to see their cultural identities represented in their writing, even in the case of something like a dissertation. So this student who identified as an Italian speaker showed that when writing different parts of the dissertation, working in English might have been easier, whereas in other parts, working in Italian was easier. So when working with methodology, research design, questions, writing in English was easier. But when this participant had to do analyses or conduct interviews, things that were more locally situated, trying to, as you can see, I simply couldn't think directly in English. So that indicates that there was this process where this participant was having to sort of move back and forth and participate in different types of translating practices to be able to convey what was happening in Italian as well as they could in English. Okay, and some similar ideas from Swedish and Portuguese speakers, indicating that one of their practice was to use different translation tools. So Google Translate, moving the language back and forth, until the meaning in English and the meaning in Swedish were close enough to satisfy this participant. And then the Portuguese speaker, the second, this participant specifically mentioned bringing more Portuguese meaning into wording and phrase construction, and recognized that this was something that he was encouraged to take away from his writing. So students who are writing their dissertations continue to indicate problems with vocabulary, syntax, semantics. So, it's it's more than just the meaning making process. There are those very technical components to the language as well. But before we can even get to that level of editing, we have to make sure that that we're looking more at a descriptive approach to grammar than a prescriptive approach. So part of what I want to share in this conversation is how difficult it is for multilingual writers to say what they want to say in academic English when we have such standards and expectations in place that we do, especially if programs do not provide the level of support that certain students need to develop their academic writing in English. So I'm going to get to some ways that we can be supportive there. Okay. And this was another example. Maybe you had a chance to take a look at those while I was speaking there for a second, but these participants really are seeing themselves as having dual identities, thinking in one language, writing in another language, but doing these translanguaging activities sort of in the background. So translanguaging, like I said, students are already doing it. The idea here is that I'm advocating for pedagogy and programming that supports those practices. So recognizing students' linguistic and cultural identities as resources. So, moving away from English-only classrooms or connecting students with colleagues or other peers who may share their linguistic or cultural identities, where they have more opportunities to work among different languages to produce meaning. Discussing translanguaging practices, just bringing more attention to what this is and that it's okay for students to actively practice, writing and translating as a means of finding the words that they want to say that best represent themselves in their writing. Promoting and integrating practices into our teaching, into our programming. And just in general, approaching English in the plural. So thinking of English as English is sort of starts to break down those ideas of standards and expectations. So when we think of English as a lingua franca in academia, maybe we think of Englishes as the lingua franca in academia, accepting that many people bring many different forms of English into the conversation and into their writing. Another thing we can do is design a linguistically inclusive environment. Even if you have a monolingual instructor, such as myself, I'm a monolingual, I only use English, I can still support this environment with the students that I work with and in the classes that I teach. And then finally, exploring, making sure that we recognize that writing is identity work and a meaning-making process, even if that writing is technical, scientific, whatever it might be. I interviewed many different students and got survey responses from many students all over the world. And many of them shared that this was important to them, that they felt a sense of authorship and ownership in their writing, whether they were, humanities, engineering, computer science, whatever it may have been. Okay, so I'd like to close with this question. Keeping standards, proficiency, and translanguaging in mind, thinking about how these intersect. Since English is the language of production in academia, where does translanguaging find support in dissertation writing specifically and in doctoral programs, considering perceptions of academic English are slow to evolve? So I'm hoping that by sharing a presentation like I did today, maybe I can just help bring awareness to translanguaging and offer some new ways that we can support our doctoral students worldwide as they continue to write and produce in English. Thank you.